Welcome to Macon Memories. I'm Lynda Wright at Randolph-Macon College. Today is May the 5th, 2010, and I'm here today with Mr. John Werner and Mr. Jack Russell.
I'm Jack Russell, class of 1944.
I'm John Werner, class of 1953.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Werner, I'll start with you. Both of you are Randolph-Macon alumni, but for background, can you tell us a bit about how and when you came to Randolph-Macon College?
Well, I was actually talking about that at lunch with another alumnus. I finished high school in Alexandria, Virginia, and I had a bunch of good friends up there, and one of them said, why don't we all go to college together? And 6 of us came down here same year. The guy who encouraged us all to go together and who led us down here wound up getting kicked out on an honor violation a week before he would have graduated.
Oh, no.
That's how I got here.
Oh, wow.
Well, I came here in 1940, which was just immediately before World War II. And it was close, but I was away from home. We lived in Richmond, and I didn't want to go to the University of Richmond. It's a good, fine school, but I just didn't want to go to school there. And I didn't want to go too far from home I just didn't want to go too far from home. And so Ashland fit the bill perfectly, plus the fact that I had been a Methodist all my life, and it was a Methodist-related school, so we came up here. My father brought me up here.
Mm-hmm. Any faculty in particular that influenced you that you'd like to talk about?
To come here?
Once you were here.
Dr. Fox, Early Fox, was a friend of my father's, and he was my faculty advisor. And he and Grillette Simpson were probably the two most influential with me. Grillette was the chapter advisor for the Phi Delta Thetas, and I was a Phi Delta, as was John later. And Grillette was a great influence. I saw him frequently because he was the chapter advisor, and I was, from my sophomore year on, an officer in the fraternity. And he was a good influence.
Well, Grillette Simpson was a very important person in my years out at the college also, as was Dr. Mabry, who taught history. And, I don't know if they still do it here or not, but when I was in school, everybody in the senior class had to take the graduate record examinations. And the faculty used the results to strengthen the curriculum, And when I got my graduate record exam results back, my best scores were in English, and I was seated with Grillette Simpson at the time, and I said, looks like I should have majored in English. He said, I've been trying to tell you that for 4 years.
Okay, thank you. Well, today I really want to focus on your experience for both of you serving on the Board of Trustees of the college. So can you tell us about how and when you were first selected to be on the Board of Trustees, which board members you already knew, and how you became involved in that?
Well, I was asked to come on the board in 1975, and the board members that I knew at that time were John and a member of the board named Wilmer Mackey, who was a very close friend and a member of the same church in Richmond, Trinity United Methodist. I knew Purnell Bailey, did off just as I came on. Jim Turner, bunch of preachers, wasn't it? And I might think of some others, Lynda, but they were the main ones right now.
Well, I was working at the bank in Richmond, and I got a telephone call from Porter Hardy, who was an alumnus of the college, a long-term trustee. He actually was the brother of Dr. Moreland's wife, and he said that they wanted me to join the board of the college. I can remember being absolutely thrilled by that, but I don't recall knowing anybody on the board before I joined the board. If I did, it might have been one or two.
You both came on the board in the early to mid-'70s. And now the college had admitted women as full-time residential students in the fall of 1971. Was that still an issue for the board to work through, any issues surrounding that, or had pretty much that been settled by the time you came on the board?
Well, John came on a little before I did, but my recollection is that the issues were pretty well settled. I don't recall any specific problem within the board about women students, any more than about men students. We had problems, of course, or we discussed from time to time students in general. And the president of the student body was an ex officio member of the board of trustees and attended all the meetings. And I remember them being on the board, but they always participated. There were never any problems that I can recall right this minute.
Well, Jack, you'll remember that before either one of us joined the board, Luther Wright was president of the college, and he invited you and I and Al Chenery and one or two others out here to what you would currently call a focus group. And the subject on the table was coeducation, and he was reaching out to find what other people might feel about it. Decision hadn't yet been made to go co-ed, but he was trying to get the sense of the alumni body and anybody else involved. I know that my reaction at the time was no, I don't want to go co-ed, but the consensus was yes, and by the time, you see, that took place probably around 1970, and so by the time that I got on the board, it had been done. There were girls here. I can tell you how I changed my attitude. One of my children came out here, and this was after the school was co-ed. And in those days, they always had a orientation week luncheon for what they called heirlooms or whatever. Right. And so my wife and I came out with our son who was enrolling as a freshman, and the luncheon was down in Crenshaw Gymnasium, and there were all sorts of classmates of mine or guys that I'd been in college with there with their daughters who were enrolling. And I looked around, and those girls were so pretty that I figured, why not?
You know, and apropos of that, I don't recall, John, the conference with Luther beforehand, but after it was over, and I was talking to Luther one day, and he and I were good friends. He was a year behind me in school, and he was also a Phi Delta. And then we had gone through law school together as classmates, studied together, and he was a good friend. And I was out here talking to him one time, and he told me the story. And he said that he had school, and I won't try to enumerate what all of them are, but he'd gone through all of them to see how they felt. And he had pretty unanimous consent, if you want to call it, to do it. And he said, I remember very clearly. This was in the winter, I guess, when he made the decision, because he said, I went over to the admissions office, and Ed Cox was the director of admissions at the time. Mm-hmm. He said, I walked into Ed's office and I said, Ed, I want 50 women on this campus next fall. No, next fall. And Ed said, this coming fall? But he had them.
Thank you. That sounds like then both of you were very involved with the college from before you were members of the board. From the time you graduated, you kept your connection with the college. And if there's anything particular you'd like to say about that time, how you kept in touch with the college, it sounds like both of you were met. You mentioned you were a good friend of Mr. Wright's and that you were part of a focus group. So if you want to talk about any of that interim period, we can do that now.
Another incident, Jack, where you and I were involved, where Conrad Dormitory currently sits, there were 3 frame fraternity houses. They had originally been faculty housing. And Jack mentioned that he's a Phi Delta, I'm a Phi Delta. Luther White was a Phi Delta. And the college wanted to put up Conrad for girls. And the subject was, well, what are we going to do with your fraternity guys that are in those 3 houses now? And the college made available to us the property over on whatever that street is.
Henry Street. No, College Avenue.
No, it's not
College Avenue.
Henry, no.
It's College Avenue, right across from Wash Frank Hall.
It's where the Lambda Chi's and Phi Caps are. No, Phi Caps were further up the street, but the Phi Deltas and the Lambda Chi's, which are next to each other, had been neighbors where Conrad is. And then the Kappa Sigs, I forget where they moved. But that was another involvement where there was an attempt, to face a problem, which was housing for girls, and yet, make arrangements for those who were displaced by that dormitory. And it went off very well.
Yes, and I remember that when we were told that we could have access or could use one of those lots to build a house, but they left it up to us, the fraternities, to raise the money and build the house. The school wasn't going to do that for us. Right. And so the Phi Delts formed a house corporation. John and I both were on the board of directors. And one of the students, one of the Phi Delts' father, was an architect. And he volunteered, really. We didn't pay him anything, I don't think. Volunteered to draw the plans. And those 2 houses, the Lambda Chi's and the Phi Deltas, are identical. He drew the plans and drew them exactly alike. And then each of us took initiative to get the money together and build the houses. And so we saw that house go up. And then Luther came to me sometime later and wanted me to sign a lease. And I said, well, why should I sign a lease, Luther? We own the house. And he didn't question that we owned the house, and the subject was dropped. We never got into it. It was years later before we ever signed a lease was ever signed on that house.
I guess it was basically a land lease.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And I understand even now that there is some contention between the administration and one of the fraternities about their house. And
that house you're talking about has been vacant for 2 years.
Yes. But as far as the Phi Deltas are concerned, we have a lease good through 1930-something. It's 23 more years. And the school hasn't overtly said anything, but I think they would rather we had agreed to terminate the lease and let us sign an agreement to use the house. But so far we've stuck to our guns.
That's good. And when you both came on the board during the 1970s, the college was experiencing severe financial difficulties, running some deficits and some mainly running deficits. Can you talk about the strategies the board undertook to move the college to a stronger financial position?
John, you go first on this one.
Well, I'm embarrassed to tell you that I'm not sure what year I came on, but I think it was 73. And as I mentioned earlier, when Porter Hardy invited me to join the board, I was thrilled. When I came to by the end of the first board meeting, I was desolate because one of the agenda items was the financial audit for the previous year, and we were in deep deficit financially. We on a $5 million budget, we had an accumulated operating loss of over $1 million. We were going to one of the banks in Richmond a couple times a year because, you'd get your tuition in September, but by the time second semester rolled around, money was gone. You need to borrow some more, and it was very awkward. The other thing that troubled me about that first meeting was that as they do still, you were handed a kind of a 3-ring binder that had all kind of stuff in it for new trustees. And, the binder had things like bylaws, articles of incorporation, committees, all that sort of thing. And it also had short biographies of each of the sitting trustees. And I looked around the table, and I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that probably 20-25% of them were sleeping, they were dozing. And when I got home that evening, I took those bios and I added up all of the ages and I divided by the number of trustees, and I came up with 68. That was the average. And so what I found, at that first meeting was a somewhat disengaged board who were presented a very serious financial problem. Very discouraging. Mm-hmm. Now, how did we deal with it? Well, we didn't deal with it all at once because we needed more people who were upset about it than we had at the time. And as new trustees came on board, I think every new trustee was upset. And, finally, the board got much more involved in fundraising for the college. It got much more involved in budgeting issues. It just was, there was a level of activism on the board that had not been there, to my knowledge, before that for some years.
Well, as a follow-up to John's comments, I came on about 2 years after he did, and there was obviously a concerted effort on the board's part to lower the age of the trustees. Wilmer Mackey must have come on about the time you did.
I don't remember.
He was on there when I came on. Mm-hmm. And then I know that not long after I came on, a year or two, we got Roy Davis on the board. Mm-hmm. And that was aimed also at the finances because John was knowledgeable about finances. He was about the only one. And Roy Davis was the treasurer of Reynolds Metals. Mm-hmm. And was chairman of their finance committee, or on their finance committee. So, I figured that, and he was a good Methodist. I figured that he would add an element to it that we didn't have, and he did. And we got enough people interested to begin to actively manage the college. Really, I guess that's what it was. And,
well, you mentioned Stiles, whose portrait's out here, Ned Stiles, who lives across the way, and Ned was chief financial officer of A.H. Robbins. So there was another guy who came on the same time I did, whose role was finance in his own company.
we began to get people who were knowledgeable about that on the board intentionally to try and help with this long-standing problem. And we did. And we ultimately succeeded over the time I was there. I think they got the budget pretty well in balance, didn't they, by 1980 something?
It took, I don't know, 6-7 years.
We did some soul searching.
We were digging ourselves out of a deep hole.
Yeah. We did some serious soul searching. And there were some related issues that come to mind now to finances and that type of thing. And one was, I remember the board got real concerned about the faculty. Because we had, and I don't know how many, and I'm not going to call any names, but we had some faculty members who didn't appear to be carrying their respective shares of the load. They were hangers-on. And I remember that brought up the subject of tenure. Because with the tenure system, I mean, it's good and it's bad. And the bad part is that a deadhead, unless you've got some kind of merit system in there built in too, can hang on. Once he gets tenure, he's there for life unless you want to fire him. And that brings on a whale of a controversy. Well, George Oliver was the faculty member that was related to the board, and he attended our board meetings. And we got into some discussions about tenure. And there were some of us, I don't know how you felt, John, but there were some of us who were in favor of abolishing tenure. And George really went through the roof when he... And George was one of those people who wouldn't have been affected. He was one of the best faculty members up here. But he was out there defending these poor guys who were deadheads. And it did do one thing. We started putting in some merit increases, I think. Pay increases.
That was a fight, too.
That was a fight, too. Oh, yes. But we finally got that through.
Why were they against the merit pay?
Well, it was really the, we first got serious about the merit pay issue when Liddell Payne was newly president. And he had been a faculty person where he came from in California. He was sympathetic to faculty interests. And, in candor, he just dragged his feet as long as he could. There was pretty strong sentiment on the board for a merit pay system, but it took us, 3-4 years to finally get it implemented. It was a long time of mourning.
We got it.
Yeah.
And
I can remember one of our trustees who was really kind of mean about tenure, mean when he talked to the faculty about it, And tell you the truth, he hurt his own issue, by his attitude. And I didn't have much problem with it, basically because I knew it meant so much to the faculty. And, there's a saying that the reason faculty politics are so savage is because the stakes are so low. And, it is still, it'll always be an issue because there'll always be board members who don't see the point, And I guess the whole basic idea is academic freedom. Teach what you want to. I don't know that that's ever been jeopardized out here, I don't think any board member, I'm not aware of any effort on the part of any board member to tell a faculty what to teach.
Oh, we didn't get too deeply involved in the curriculum, school, administration. But some of us felt pretty strongly about merit pay increases because we figured it would have a very beneficial effect in either getting some of those people who appeared to be, I call them deadheads, get them to teaching, or they'd have to keep living on a low salary. and that would eventually have its effect. And it did. We began to get an improvement in the faculty in general.
Did you have much interaction with the faculty? You mentioned George Oliver as the faculty representative to the Board of Trustees. Did you have much occasion to meet with faculty? I know now the current president has provided a lot of opportunities since I've been here for the faculty and the trustees to meet on trustee weekends, but I gather that's a new development.
Well, you're talking about, I guess, social type events. Yeah. You know, I have been on the board in 2 different terms, 19 years the first time, 3 years the second time, separated by 3 or 4 years. And during most of those years, I was on what ultimately evolved in the Academic Affairs Committee. We had a meeting out here last Friday. And those Academic Affairs Committee are heavy with faculty. We interview every candidate for tenure. We interview every candidate for full professor. We went through all of that stuff last Friday. And it's a wonderful opportunity to, to get below the curriculum vitae and see what you're dealing with. I think most of us on that committee are very much impressed with the quality of the people on the teaching faculty out here and on the library faculty.
Good.
But so I've never felt like I lacked contact with faculty, but I guess I haven't had much in the way of social contact.
There wasn't much. In fact, there wasn't any that I recall. And as a matter of fact, I don't recall many social occasions for the trustees, just the trustees. Maybe once or twice a year. But there weren't any great numbers that I recall. Do you recall it, John, back in those early days?
I'm sorry.
Social events for trustees. I mean, we came up here to the meetings and then went home.
Yeah.
That was about it.
Thank you. That leads me into the something I wanted you to talk about was the development of the board as a body, sort of the changes in size of the board from the time you came on to, if that changed, or strategies to strengthen the bonds among the members, outreach to other members, the ratio of alumni to non-alumni, those sorts of issues about the growth and development of the board.
Well, I was here the shortest period, so during the time I was here, there was a concerted effort to strengthen the board. I don't recall a great deal of discussion about enlarging the board. That came right near the end of the time that I served. But prior to that, though, there was a serious concern about getting, let's put it this way, better quality trustees. I'm a longtime Methodist, and the board had quite a few Methodist ministers on it. That began to diminish while I was on there. Be down to the fact that we had, I think, only 3 ministers, besides the bishop. The bishop is an automatic member, but at the time he was a woman now, and he never came to speak of. But the ministers did, and Jim, the board had he was
best I can think of.
Yes, and the others, to a great extent, Lynda came and attended the meetings and went home, and they didn't participate in the meetings even very much, in the whole board meeting. There was a tendency to try to get Methodists, but there was also a growing feeling that we should go out and get qualified people, alumni if they were available, but even in some cases getting non-alumni whom we could interest in being on the board. And that was beginning to pay off. And I think it was after I left the board that they began to enlarge the board even more.
I can't remember how big it was when I joined. I'm guessing probably 15, 16, 18, something like that. And I have been concerned over the years that it's grown too large. I mentioned to Jack driving out here today that there's a sort of an axiom that the larger the board, the less engaged each member is going to be, you know. And I don't know whether that's true or not, but it was certainly my opinion. But, you know, Jimmy Butler, who was chairman of the board for a number of years, was not an alumnus. And I would have to tip my hat to him. Jimmy had a lot to do with getting this financial ship back on keel. He, you know, without Jimmy, we wouldn't have Estes Dining Hall, because he beat up on Ed Estes to come up with the money, and I don't know anybody else that could have pulled that money out of Ed.
Both of them came from Chase City, and they knew each other very well. As a matter of fact, one of the funniest things I ever remember was that the first time I heard Jimmy Butler refer to Ed Estes, he called him Hard Rock. And that was his nickname, apparently. But he ran a trucking line, and apparently he ran it pretty hard. But Jimmy did a great job. He was not a college graduate, but his son came here. His grandson came here. And I don't know whether anyone else in the family has or not. But we got some non-alumni. I think Luther White was the one who got Jimmy Butler on here. And I don't know how he got on to him. But I think Luther's the one that got him on the board. And then, of course, Luther was also instrumental in Eddie Estes. And Eddie was another non-alumnus who became very interested in the school. He's made some major contributions to the school, financially and otherwise, mainly financial, I guess.
Thank you. Would you like to talk about the capital campaigns that the board undertook while you were serving on the board? I'm thinking after President Payne came, there were a couple of targeted capital campaigns, and if you want to talk about those, the board's role.
There wasn't. I was talking to John about this coming up here, and I don't recall any major campaign while I was on the board. I left in 1983, and I think it was about that time that they were getting ready to start a major campaign.
Well, there was one under Jimmy Butler's administration.
There was?
Yeah. It was $15 million, and we didn't make it.
Well, $15 million is so small nowadays that I didn't even think about
but
it.
if you take a dollar deflator and move it back to 1970 or something like that, it was a lot of money. I have in my wallet a little thing that'll tell you what a dollar is worth. I think the fact that we didn't make the goal was very discouraging. And I remember Harris Kessler, who was also a trustee, and Harris was a Methodist minister on the board. And he made a remark that I always wanted to hear more about, but I never did. And he wondered, he said, why is it that we can't raise the money we need? Is it the Methodist thing? And I never knew what he meant. But I guess to get back to your question, yes, we did have a capital funds campaign. We got close. I guess we probably got 14 million, but we needed the 15, and we didn't get it. And I guess when Liddell came along, there was a different cast of characters on the board. There were people who had more financial substance, and we didn't repeat that very disappointing showing.
The Methodist thing, if I may go in that direction now, which is interesting, John, that the Methodist thing was the fact that this school was established by the Methodist Church in 1830, literally by the Methodist Church. And over the years, particularly after it moved to Ashland, the college began to move a little bit, I mean, not perceptibly in any one year, away from the church to some extent. They had non-Methodist ministers, non-Methodists on the board. Luther Wright was the last Methodist president we've had. It was at the time we were getting ready to find his replacement that the board had a discussion about, are we going to require that they be Methodists or not? And even though I've been a lifelong Methodist, I felt that we should not insist. I'd like for it to be, but that it didn't have to be. And then Liddell came. But alcohol had a presence on the campus when I came here in 1940.
It's never gone
Even
away.
though it was undercover, because in those days there was a strict rule about no alcohol on the campus.
Because it was Methodist.
Yes. And the administration they announced it, and they claimed that they enforced it, but they never came and searched the houses. They've turned the houses. And the faculty advisor, Grillette, for instance, he knew we had alcohol on weekends. Now, there wasn't a great deal, I'll say that, because in my class of pledges set right to the Fidels, I don't think more than one or two drank. The rest of them didn't. That isn't true any longer, I'm sure, but it was true then. And but we had parties, beer parties, mostly. We get a kid.
You're talking about the Methodist thing. You think it was the
Church.
You see, I don't think that's what he was talking about.
I do. I think it was that because I remember some real controversies because I was a delegate to the annual conference. And I remember, John, some real controversies up on the floor of the conference.
I know there were controversies, but I don't think that that's what Harris Kessler was referring to.
Oh, well, he's a Methodist preacher. He knew what was going on the floor of the conference. I bet you that's what it was. Because
we're not going to agree about that.
No, but
in the context of raising money, you mean he said, so what do you think he meant when he said the Methodist thing?
I think he meant that it was harder to get money out of Methodists than it was out of Episcopalians or Presbyterians.
Well,
That's what I thought you meant.
historically, Methodists have had less money than Episcopalians.
That's maybe what he was talking about.
That's true. And that was one of the reasons that we were moving away from Methodists, whether they were Methodists or not. And yet, some of the people who had money were Methodist. I think of this one is McGraw-Page. She was a Methodist. And she was gotten on the board because she was a Methodist, because we were discussing it. Jim Turner was on the board, and he had been pastor of her church in Roanoke, and he knew her. He knew what she had. And then a minister named Henry Carter.
Gene Carter, not Henry Carter. Gene Carter, who was a very active alumnus. And he was
became the minister of her church. And the two of them, I think, got her to agree to come on the board. And that's one example I can think of a Methodist who came on the board and who had money. Didn't many of them. Eddie Estes was a minister, was a Methodist, and he had money. Jimmy Butler had some money. He was a Methodist, but not many of them.
So I was going to ask you here. Well, we've talked a little bit about the raising money. I guess the other big thing you think of the board is doing is raising money for the college and also selecting a president. So you were both on the board, I think, when you were in the search for a new president with President Payne. Can you talk about what the board was looking for and how that process worked?
Well, to go back before that, if you would, I was on the committee that selected Luther Wright as an alumnus. But in those days, and that was interesting, there's been another interesting change that's taken place. In those days, traditionally, a search committee was 9 people, 3 alumni, 3 trustees, and 3 faculty. And that was the committee that looked for, and well, Luther was on the committee. and I remember very clearly we were having a meeting down at the Downtown Club in Richmond, and Purnell Bailey, who was at that time a trustee, and I was the president of the Alumni Society at that time, which is how I got on the committee, because I had to appoint 3 trustees, and I appointed myself, Luther Wright, and Dick Irby. I forget the Purnell Panel, and I forget who the other 2 faculty members were, and then Purnell Bailey, and for the life of me, I can't remember who the other 2 trustees were. And the bishop may have been on the committee. I can't recall. But nevertheless, we were striking out in our efforts to find somebody. And we were having a lunch, and Luther excused himself from the room. And Purnell got up immediately and said, we have the person for this job right here on this committee, and suggested Luther. Well, then we had to keep him out of the room while we discussed that. And then I remember one other little incident, that they gave Dick Irby and me the job of convincing him to take it, to tell him we wanted to nominate him and to the board, and to convince him to take it. And we played several rounds of golf at the Golden Horseshoe, the 3 of us, before we got him convinced.
So he was reluctant.
Yes. He was very active in his law practice, and he really was cut out to be a lawyer. He didn't, and it turned out to be ultimately be a good college president. But he was deeply involved in his law practice. He had a good practice, and I think he was reluctant to give it up. But he finally agreed.
Thank you. How about with calling President Payne? Do you remember what characteristics you were looking for in a president, or how was the whole board involved, or just a committee?
No, there was a search committee, and Jim Turner was chairman of it.
He was?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And one student on it. There were a couple of faculty members, and I think George Oliver might have been one of them. And but it was mostly, probably 6 or 7 trustees. And I'm not sure that they had a menu that they were looking for. Maybe they did, but I was unaware of it. But they were very diligent in what they were doing. They, elicited a lot of interest from people all over creation.
Did they did they hire a consultant?
I don't think so.
I just wondered how they found the deal.
I don't remember. The only consultants that I ever had anything to do with were for the capital funds campaigns. Mm-hmm. And they were close to useless. But
Oh, the consultant is the one who found Bob Lindgren.
well, I think Ben Shapiro had a hand in that. But in any event, what I do remember about the selection of Liddell Payne was that the search committee came up with 3 finalists, and I can't remember much about the third one, but the other finalist was a gentleman who came here looking for this job. He was a faculty person up at Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania, and in each of these cases, you know, we always had the spouse accompany them for these interviews, and of course Gene Payne accompanied Liddell, and I was torn between Liddell and this guy from Franklin and Marshall, and what tipped the balance was Jean. You know, she just had that personality. And that's what we lit on. But, you know, what characteristics were we looking for? I'm sure that, you know, I'm sure we were looking for an academic. You know, I'm sure we were looking for someone with some experience. And, you know, Liddell had been assistant to the president out at Claremont McKenna, and had, you know, was right on the fringe of administration of a college with that role. You know, I've thought a lot about Liddell over the years, and the thing that he brought to this college was peace, because it was deeply riven by all sorts of issues, and he kind of brought, you know, the way he dealt with people, it sort of calmed people down, and there was less divisiveness amongst the trustees. There was less divisiveness with the faculty, and so I've always credited him with bringing peace.
That's great.
Well, he undoubtedly did a good job, because he stayed 18 years. And the school was in better condition all the way around after he left, or when he left, than it was when he got here. And so he led it through some pretty tough times. And as John said, he did restore peace between the faculty and the trustees, and the trustees and the administration, and there had been some pretty deep concerns between the trustees and the administration at one time. So he did a whole lot for us, a whole lot.
He was here last Friday evening. They had a dinner over at the President's. Nita and I couldn't go, but it was somehow commemorating his 30th anniversary of his inauguration.
Oh.
Well, I did an interview, as I mentioned, with President and Mrs. Payne a couple of years ago, and I really got the sense that they were a partnership position on the staff at the college.
Yeah. Jane was, you know, when Liddell was on the faculty at Claremont McKenna, Gene had a pretty good job, and I don't know exactly what it was, but it was a job of some consequence with one of the California community colleges. And I think when she came here with Liddell, she missed that. She missed having her own professional role, and it was only after some agonizing, that the college hired her, because there was some question as how is Liddell going to evaluate her performance for salary review?
Right.
And, carefully, very carefully. But I think that job, it was sort of events organizer, that sort of a thing. It was sort of a natural for her. She worked for the Richmond Symphony too, you know, in fundraising.
I'm not sure I did know that, but yeah. Can we talk just a minute about the board's involvement with the restoration of the historic campus?
Well, it may have been beginning at about the time that I left, but there hadn't been any real, in my recollection, up to 1983, hadn't been any real effort to, there'd been some talk about it, but they hadn't actually done anything. It was all after that, right after that it came around. Wash Frank Hall was the first thing. And then, of course, the second thing was Pace Hall.
And the old chapel.
And then the old chapel. And I think that, well, that may have been before that, because I know that Duncan Memorial Church, formerly, when I came here as a student, Duncan Memorial Church was in the second floor of the old chapel, and had been for years. And the school owned the buildings across the three houses. They had acquired them somewhere along the line. And the one on the corner, or maybe the two, were demolished. And the college offered the church the opportunity to build over there, and there's an arrangement. The college owns that real estate, but the church owns the building. And the college, interestingly enough, of course it owns all that property, so they own the parking lot. And the church uses it on the weekends, and then some of the church members can park there, but the college, there's a sign up at the beginning of that parking lot that says it's available for faculty and staff of the church. And of course the driveway goes on behind Blackwell Auditorium. But it's a very happy relationship, as far as I know. And Duncan Memorial, to the extent that there is a Methodist church related to this school, is it.
So, restoration of the historic campus, you know, when I enrolled here in fall of 1949, and Wash Frank was sort of the administrative headquarters of the college. On the second floor, down on the first floor, they had, you know, Washington Literary Society and whatever was on the other side, Franklin. But after I was here a couple of years, Wash Frank was condemned. I'm guessing that the town of Ashland did it. It was in very poor condition. And the administrative officers, Dr. Moreland and Dean Simpson and all that, their colleagues moved into the basement, actually, of Mary Branch Dormitory. And they stayed there a long time until they moved into the building that was formerly the library that had college's history had really been erected through solicitations led by a student, a Lambert fella, Listerine, and one of his descendants married Paul Mellon. You know, probably at the time as rich as anybody in Virginia. And Mrs. Mellon, Liddell Payne, God bless him, he got next to Mrs. Mellon because Lambert was on her side of the family. And we talked him into coming up with a restoration for Wash Frank. And what a beautiful restoration it was. And then a fellow who I guess maybe preceded both of us, that Armistead gentleman, who had been with Landmark Communications. He ran the newspaper over in Roanoke. He was an alumnus and was very interested in the college and came up with the money to redo Pace Hall. I think they call it Pace Armistead now. And I got to tell you, I'm a little murky as to exactly when the old chapel ceased to be the church and just became a restored building for classroom purposes and whatnot. But you know, when we finally got Wash Frank back into first-class condition, it removed a great big embarrassing blot on the campus. You know, you got probably the most historic building on campus, and it's abandoned because of its condition. You know, it's an embarrassment.
Pace Hall never got that bad. It was still being used, but it was not in the best of condition. And Bill Armistead was an alumnus, but you said the Roanoke paper. He started out at the Roanoke paper. At the time that he gave him the money, $1 million, is what they put into it, I think. He was president of Landmark Communications. He'd moved to Norfolk, and he'd gone to the top. And he had the money to do it. And I'll give you an interesting piece of history to go along with it. Pace Hall was built. It was the second or third building built on the old campus. And the money to build that building, $10,000, was given by James B. Pace, who was a businessman in Richmond, who was on the Board of Trustees. He served on this board for 44 years. Oh, my goodness. He made and lost economically. He didn't throw it away. He made and lost 2 or 3 fortunes. He was an active Methodist. He was very, very generous with the college and with other places, too. In addition to Pace Hall, and that money was the entire cost of that building, $10,000. He gave the money for the old gymnasium. Not the alumni gym, the old one that's been demolished, that was here and used as a classroom building when you and I were in school here. He gave the money for that. Incidentally, he also gave the money and built, but gave the money to buy the building, buy the land and build the building for Pace Memorial United Methodist Church in Richmond, which was destroyed by fire. It was a beautiful old Gothic church, destroyed by fire. It was situated right across from Monroe Park and next to what is Rhodes Hall at VCU. And he gave the money for that, and it was then Park Place. And when he died, the board of the church changed the name to Pace Memorial. When he gave that, he was smart enough to put a reverter clause in the deed. And so when the church, anybody who loaned them the money would be exposed to having the property taken back by the family if it was ever ceased to be used for either worship or education. And it is now being used, the building is, because Pace Church is closed, being used as a campus minister building for the VCU students. But it was interesting that James B. Pace gave that building, and Bill Armstead comes along many, many years later, spends $1 million to remodel a building that cost $10,000.
You ought to involve some future interviewees into the reverter clause issue that existed for so many years with Randolph-Macon Women's College and Randolph-Macon Academy, because that was a hot button and a lot of controversy. But that's not about the. We're drifting off the subject. You want to know about the restoration of the historic campus.
Right. Anything else?
Well, I was going to add one other thing that came to mind about this Methodist thing. And then he mentioned reverter clauses in those two places, those two schools. At annual conference, there were motions made several years, year after year, to cut off the money to Randolph-Macon College because they were permitting alcohol on the campus. And it was a contention every year down there because I got up and fought it several times on the floor of the conference. And there were others that did. And they got then, I forget what his name was, the president of Washington, Randolph-Macon Women's College, up down there, and they really chastised him on the floor of the conference because of permitting alcohol on the campus at Randolph-Macon Women's College. And, of course, Fork Union, not Fork Union, but Randolph-Macon Academy is still there. I don't know, is there a reverter clause in their deed?
We canceled them.
Hey, what? We did?
Yeah.
And
That's the subject, Jack. It needs about an hour all by itself.
oh, I know that. You want to say that in case you didn't know it. This school was first. And when they decided to build the Women's College, the trustees of this school were the trustees of that school also. And when they built the academy, they were the trustees of that school also. And it was all one big system, the Randolph-Macon system. And then it gradually was broken down. But as he said, that deserves a long time of history itself. But that's the base. That's what he was talking about.
Did the board ever discuss the whole alcohol issue when you were on the board here, or how was that ever resolved with the Methodist Church, or has it not been?
Well, I think, yeah, it's been discussed. I think it's the Methodist Church's position is one that it's maybe impossible to enforce.
Well,
and it reminds me of another benefactor of the college, a gentleman up in Baltimore who was an alumnus who had a ton of money, and your buddy Wilmer Mackey went up to talk to him, get some money, and this gentleman told Wilmer, well, I'll give you, and I think he was talking about $4 million at the time. Maybe he was just toying with us, but he said, if you do two things, I'll give you some money. One, you have to abolish tenure, and two, you have to stop cohabitation in the dormitories. Well, neither one of those was a practical thing, and maybe it all boiled down to the guy didn't want to give the money. He ultimately did. He died, and he left his estate, and there's a lot of scholarship money here that flows from that gentleman's gift, but I don't think we ever got anything during his lifetime.
the church's policy on alcohol has moderated considerably. Temperance at one time was a big issue in the Methodist Church, a big deal. They had a board of temperance at one time. That's long since gone by the board. They do not require ministerial candidates to vow they will not drink alcohol. They encourage them by some way. I don't care what the words are now, but I know that that has changed. There used to be a prohibition in there for the ministers about smoking, and that's gone. So the church is moderating considerably.
Well, it's bowed to reality.
And that has a lot to do with it, I think. Now, they don't like it generally. I mean, the Methodist position is, but at the same time, there are some Methodist ministers that enjoy a glass of wine now and then. So
Good for them.
The policy has changed considerably.
You know, this came up, you asked if the subject came up at the board meetings, and of course it did a couple of times while I was on the board for the first 19 years. We sort of got at odds with the Virginia Conference of the Methodist Church. the conference came up with what they called a covenant, and they wanted the college to agree to the covenant, and it, as Jack said, that there was a little pressure there that maybe we'll cut off the annual support we give you if you don't go along. They never did. But I think one of the reasons they never did was that we were given more scholarship money to pre-ministerial candidates than we were getting from the conference. So, they didn't want to cut off their nose or spite their face. But the covenant was an emotional issue partially because so many of the trustees were Methodist laymen and clergy, and yet I think there was a general recognition that this covenant goes beyond just temperance issues, but it sort of got to the heart of who's going to run this college. And of course, that's another big subject. 1911, it went to the Hanover Court over here because the Virginia Conference of the Church felt that it owned the college, and they needed a court case to say no, the trustees own it, and they are self-perpetuating body.
Well, they're not. The conference elects them now, approves them. Because I remember, yes.
But not the way you remember, Jack.
Remember at the time, though, maybe before you, but may have been before I became on the board. I'm not sure. There were we changed the charter of this school once or twice, and I was involved in the legal aspect of it, relating to the election of trustees. Because at one time, even though they didn't own them, the conference had to approve them. And even when I was elected to come on the board in 1975, they called and asked me if I would be willing to serve in June, and told me that I couldn't start until October because they had to get the nominees approved by the annual conference at their annual session. And October was the first meeting after the annual conference held its session. So there have been a lot, and it used to be a real hot issue at conference.
But that process went by the boards sometime in the 80s.
We changed the trust. I was involved in changing the charter, and we got the charter changed without going to conference. And the policy was changed by the election of trustees and a couple of other things that were involved.
So does the conference still approve the trustees?
I think they do
They
nominate.
They rubber stamp them.
They're given the nominees and told these are who. And I'm involved in a couple of those, and the foundations nominate their directors, but the conference elects them, but they never change them. They never raise a question about them.
I don't want to keep you all too much longer, but is there any humorous or meaningful anecdote which would illuminate a particular individual or situation that you remember from a board meeting or your time on the board?
Well, as we've been talking, and we've made reference to several people who've been particularly generous financially. 10 minutes ago I was thinking about the gentleman that ran Manchester Paper Company.
Oh, Frank Brown.
Yeah, Frank
Brown.
Frank Brown was an industrialist. I think he was pretty much a self-made man. He was a wealthy man, Methodist layman, and he was chairman of the executive committee for a number of years. He was elderly, and one of the first executive committee meetings that I was a member of, the college treasurer, a guy by the name of Don Reed, was he sort of had the agenda, and he sort of ran the meeting on Mr. Brown's behalf. Because, Frank, I imagine he was 80 at that point, Well, anyway, at this particular meeting, I've thought about it 100 times. We get to this agenda item, and Don Reed, who's presenting the items to the committee, says now we have an opportunity to purchase the Blinko property over here, and that's where that fraternity house has been torn down to put the new road through. Well, Professor Blinko, who taught mathematics, lived there for many years. Well, anyway, at the time of this meeting, he had passed away, and the property was available for sale, and the family was willing to sell it to the college on a kind of a first refusal basis. And so Don Reed said, this property is available. It's going to cost so many dollars, and but we really hope that we can get it because it's contiguous to the campus, and the campus needs more land. And Mr. Brown kind of shook himself, and he said, well, how are we going to pay for it? And Don Reed said, well, Mr. Brown, before the meeting, you said you'd pay for it. And Frank says, I did, and I will. He was a delightful old guy. Every female within 100 miles was crazy about him because he had a wonderful twinkle in his eye, and he always had a bunch of pieces of little candy in his coat pocket, and he'd meet some lady, he'd meet you, and then he'd give you a piece of candy. And
Frank Brown was wealthy, and of course he gave the money, gave the money to build the plaza, and also in the campus center. So he was very generous with the school, and he was gotten on this board through the efforts of Purnell Bailey. Frank Brown belonged to Centenary United Methodist Church. Purnell was pastor of that church, and he got him on the board of trustees. There were a few instances of that, but most of our good trustees came from other sources. But
how about you, Mr. Russell? Any anecdote you remember?
I don't really remember any. During the time I was on the board, there was one thing that was done that was not popular among the Methodist ministers in general. When I came on the board, they put me on the nominations committee. And Purnell Bailey was chairman of that committee, and he only stayed one more year on the board. And after he left, they asked me if I'd be chairman of that committee. And after he left, there were no ministers on that committee. And it had always been a superintendent or a thing of that kind, without any regard to their qualifications whatsoever. And while we were on here, the committee recommended to the board, and they adopted some pretty, I won't say stringent, but we outlined the qualifications for honorary degrees. And what you had to have, what there had to be in the person's background and so forth. And I convinced the committee that the average Methodist minister, or even above average, when they became a district superintendent or something like that, they were just doing their job. They didn't make any contribution to the well-being of the church or the society or anything. They didn't deserve an honorary degree more than anybody else walking down the street did. So we cut them out. And some of the ministers beefed about it because a lot of those guys had gotten honorary degrees just by virtue of, quote, having a particular job, and not by virtue of having done anything outstanding. And apparently they must still do that to some extent, because we haven't given many honorary degrees to ministers recently, have we?
I don't think so, and I think Liddell had somewhat the same attitude that you've just expressed. That he wanted to give honorary degrees who people had shown some distinction in their lives, and
And there were a couple of ministers who had they had distinguished themselves, as John said, in the church, and they got degrees. But the guys who just became district superintendents, because the bishop picks those people at random sometimes almost, and they don't deserve honorary degrees, and they don't get them anymore. And one minister came up to me one day, though, and said he appreciated what I had done. I got the blame for all this, but he appreciated what I had done because it raised the
Did he already have his?
yes,
Yeah.
it raised the value of his degree considerably.
That's right. Yeah. Made it rarer.
Yes.
Supply and demand. Okay.
Well, just to wrap up, if you were writing the history of Randolph-Macon College, what episode would you feature as the climax of the story so far?
You know, I don't think I can give you an answer that's 100% in sync with your question. I will tell you that I was deeply involved in the reverter issue with Randolph-Macon Women's College and Randolph-Macon Academy, and that when I think back on my years of service, that probably was one of the most aggravating episodes in it, and I've just never forgotten it, And it had a lot of moving parts to it, It wasn't simple yes or no. There were a lot of considerations that needed to be balanced, but Jim Scanlon is bringing the history of the college up to date, and when we finally faced up to this reverter issue, it was during Liddell's time as president, so maybe Scanlon will give it the attention I think it deserves.
When was that, John?
It was probably late in the 80s.
Okay, I was going to say that I don't remember the issue, and I know that if I'd been on the board, I'd have been deeply involved in it too, and I just don't remember it. I knew it took place, but it was after I left the board.
The board didn't get much into it.
The board had to get into it.
The board rubber stamped what we took to them.
Okay, well,
The committee dealt with it.
that's a hard question to answer, Lynda. Surpassed or changed almost any time because so much progress is being made. Mm-hmm. We've got a master plan. We've never had a master plan before that I recall. Bob Lindgren has brought a lot to this school, and I could almost say that up to now, the election of him as president is probably one of the most advanced things and one of the best things this school has ever done. I was very interested as an alumnus and former board member when they were in the search process. Very interested in what they were doing, and I came out here. I was invited to the interview sessions, and for the first time I can recall, the search committee and the trustees agreed to have these open sessions, and they invited a whole lot of different people out here to interview the candidates, and there were 3 of them, and I came to all 3. And I remember the second one was a Jewish lawyer who was he was the chief legal officer at Michigan. Mm-hmm. And I could never understand the search committee's feeling or what they were thinking about when they suggested a person of that faith to be president of a Methodist-related school. And I'm not trying to be downgrade anybody, because the chairman of the board of trustees is a same faith, and he's doing a magnificent job up to now.
He's a breath of fresh air.
Yes, and his father, incidentally, was on the board when I was, and he's a great gentleman. But just, well, anyway, I went to the chairman of that committee and asked him, what was going through your all's mind? And he said, don't worry about that. Wait till you meet the next one. And that was Bob. And I understood fully what he meant.
You talk about Harold Stark now?
Yes.
Yeah.
I understood fully what he meant when
I
he
don't
said
think
that.
he gave you a very good answer.
Well,
what he's in effect saying is that we didn't have a third candidate.
Well, that's about right.
Yeah.
And I think that's about it. They didn't have, but and having met the other two, I would be inclined to agree with him. This man is head and shoulders above anybody they've come up here with.
Well, I'll tell you a story about my own introduction, if you will. I came out here to the dinner where he and his wife Cheryl were being interviewed, you know, and we were fortunate enough, my wife and I, to be seated at the same dinner table. And, you know, the resume that we'd all seen on Bob Lindgren, you know, it kept telling over and over about how many billions of dollars he'd raised for Johns Hopkins and all that. And it mentioned that he had like 300 people in various levels of development work at Hopkins. Steve Long was at the same table, and he called across the table to Lindgren and said, Mr. Lindgren, I understand that you've had a very large staff, 300 or so people working for you up at Hopkins, and I'm sure that when you want something done, you just pick up the phone and tell someone to do it. Do you think you can make a transition from that environment to this environment where there's very few staff and where everybody's got to really work hard? And he made a wonderful answer. He said, when I pick up the phone and call somebody at Hopkins to do something, I'm grateful if they just answer the phone. And that was so disarming, you know. But I had another experience, you know, after I left the bank, I worked at a private foundation in Richmond for a number of years and met a lot of nice people, one of whom was a guy by the name of Will Baker, who was and still is Chief Executive Officer of the Chesapeake. And in previous encounters with him, I'd learned that he was on the Johns Hopkins Board of Trustees. So after the college decides on Bob Lindgren, I picked up the phone and called Will Baker up in Annapolis, and I said, do you probably know that we've hired Bob Lindgren from Johns Hopkins as president of my college down here? Will said, yeah, I know that. And I said, well, tell me about this guy. And he said, well, first of all, he's first class. Secondly, I'm surprised you hired him. I said, why do you say that? You know, that kind of took the wind out of my sails. And he said, because he's not an academic. He said, I thought that you college people always wanted an academic to run the institution. I said, well, not this time, you know. But, and then he told me a fascinating story. At the time of this conversation, which is like 4 years ago, the chairman of the board of Johns Hopkins was a long-term trustee of Hopkins, and he was chairman of the search committee 14 years previously when Lindgren was coming from Florida to Johns Hopkins. And he told the story that during interviewing these candidates for head of development at Johns Hopkins, they asked Lindgren, you know, what do you see, what do you want to achieve in your professional career? And I never heard a better answer. Bob Lindgren told him 18 years ago now, I want to be the president of a residential liberal arts college. Isn't that wonderful?
Oh, wow.
And they hired him in spite of it.
In spite of,
That's right. That's
in
right.
spite of it, the other finalist was alumnus Scott Colley,
Right.
who had been at Berry College and before they'd been dean at Hampton-Sydney. And I was sort of, I knew Scott and I was partial to him, but he was 62 years old. And, that's when things start to unravel, in a man at least. And I didn't want to be hiring somebody where we were going to look down the throat of some health issues.
Well, we needed somebody who could serve a long tenure,
Well,
if they would.
But he was 62. He was already 62. And so there's a little age discrimination.
That's good. That's good. Well, any final thoughts before we say goodbye? Thank you so much for all that you've shared with us today. And
Well, thank you, Lynda.
No, I appreciate it and having the opportunity, and it's been a very interesting and enjoyable experience. I almost was ready to say that when you finish all of this, I'd like to hear some of the other ones, but at the pace that you all are going, is this the second or third one, or of the trustees,
The first.
or first?
trustees, but this is about almost my 30th interview of my project.
Okay, but you got to do some more trustees. I was going to say it'd be interesting to listen to some of the others and see what they recall. Because
Well, but Lynda wrote to me. She talked about pairing me up with Johnny Clements, and that got to be, at least in my mind, a scheduling
Is that-
issue.
picking it up,
But Johnny Clements is definitely somebody that you should be talking to.
But thank you. I was glad to speak with you all today. Thank you.
it's a shame.